All right, so we're on our last type of poem. And this week we're going to be looking at the sonnet. So the sonnet is a lyric poem. It's always 14 lines long. It's written in iambic pentameter. It has a definite rhyme scheme and a definite thought structure. That means that it's organized in the same way. Each sonnet develops kind of in the same way, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. So, just a reminder from when we talked about odes, a lyric poem deals with emotions. Odes were also lyric poems, and a sonnet is another type of lyric poem. So, it deals with emotions and feelings of the poet. It also uses iambic pentameter, which we talked about, which I talked about in the last video. So remember, iambic pentameter means five measures, units, or meters. Those all mean the same thing of iambs. Now remember, an iamb is a metrical foot consisting of an unaccented syllable, represented by the letter U, followed by an accented syllable, represented by the forward slash. Again, that would be an example of an iamb. One unit has an unstressed and a stressed syllable. When we take 5 of those units, we have iambic pentameter. Remember, penta means 5. Here are 2 iambs together. Immortalize. So here's an example of iambic pentameter from a pretty famous poem. I don't know if you'll recognize it or not. One day I wrote her name upon the strand, but came the waves and washed it all away. Again I wrote it with a second hand, but came the tide and made my pains his prey. So this is a sonnet from Edmund Spenser. If you'll notice, it has a set rhyme scheme as well as iambic pentameter. So the rhyme scheme is A, B, A, B. It uses some of the same literary devices that we talked about. It personifies the tide. So he's writing basically his love's name on the sand. He says strand, but it means sand. And the waves came and washed it away. And so then he wrote it again. And then the tide came. So when the tide came in the evening, it also washed it away. But he personifies the tide. He uses his to represent the tide, that pronoun. So there are 2 main types of sonnets, the Petrarchan sonnet and the Shakespearean or English sonnet. We're not going to really focus on the Petrarchan sonnet. I've included in here just for, information. Petrarch was the first person to write sonnets, and he wrote them in honor of a woman named Laura. So, what can I say? He has good taste. But yeah, we're not going to talk too much about Petrarch. We're going to move on and talk about the Shakespearean sonnet, the English sonnet. And the rhyme scheme for a Shakespearean sonnet is A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G. So it ends with that rhyming couplet, 3 quatrains and a rhyming couplet. So one thing, though, I think I should back up and say is that even though it's in 4 quatrains, it's still actually divided up into 8 lines and then the bottom 6 lines. So the first 8 lines do one thing, and the bottom 6 lines do another thing. So let's take a look at Shakespeare's most famous sonnet, Sonnet 18. First, I'm just going to read it, and I want you to think about what is Shakespeare doing in the first 8 lines, and then what does he start doing in the last 6 lines? Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometimes too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is gold complexion dimmed. At every fair from fair sometimes declines, by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest, nor shall death brag thou wondrest in his shade. When in eternal lines to time thou growest, so long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. So we can see the rhyme scheme here. Follows the English rhyme scheme. The thought structure, the first 8 lines, the octave, presents the situation or idea. And then the sestet or sextet, the 6 lines, responds to the situation or idea that's set up by the first 8 lines. So the point between the 8 lines and the 6 lines, we call that the turn. It's where things slightly change in the poem, and the bottom lines start responding to the top. So you want to look for that turn in a sonnet. So let's go back over Sonnet 18. The octave describes the ways in which the summer's day is inferior to his beloved, his lover. Okay, he says, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" And he gives all the reasons why she is better than a summer's day. Sometimes there's rough winds on a summer's day, and summer's over too quickly. Sometimes it's too hot. Or sometimes the sun is hidden, his whole gold complexion is dimmed. Every fair from fair sometimes declines. So even the most beautiful things, decline sometimes. They're not as beautiful as they could be because of chance or nature's changing. So the weather can change. And so, things that could be really beautiful one day, the next day, because of the weather, could look totally differently. So the octave is kind of setting up this idea in which summer is inferior to her. So the sestet, the 6 lines, describes the ways in which the beloved is superior to the summer's day. So both of these are in praise. One of them does it by showing how summer's inferior, and the next set shows how the lover's superior. So the focus goes from summer in the first 8 lines to the same theme, but the focus is going to be on the woman instead. So he also uses a metaphor here. Thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of the fair thou owest. So you're always going to look your best. Death is not going to rob you. And we've got death personified here. Nor shall death brag thou wondrest in his shade. Death's not going to brag that you are his captive. When in eternal lines to time thou growest. Now, this is kind of an interesting line because he's making a play on the word lines. First, we can take it as in, the lines and wrinkles that you get as you age. But it also is in reference to the lines of poetry. He is recording this love for her and praise of her, so that anyone who reads it for centuries to come, she's going to live on through the poem. So that's where we get, so long as men can breathe, their eyes can see, so long lives this. And this he's talking about is the poem. And he's saying this poem gives life to thee. So sonnets are pretty cool. There's typically some kind of like puzzle or some like double meanings that you have to kind of figure out. I always enjoy reading sonnets and trying to figure out, how things could be read in more than one way. Let's look at another sonnet. Sonnet 29. When in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, I all alone between my outcast state, and trouble deaf heaven with my bootless cries, and look upon myself and curse my fate, wishing me like to one more rich in hope, featured like him with friends possessed, desiring this man's art and that man's scope, with what I most enjoy, contented least. Yet in these thoughts, myself almost despising, haply I think on thee, and then my state, like to the lark at break of day arising, from sullen earth sings hymns at heaven's gate, for thy sweet love remembered such wealth brings, that then I scorn to change my state with kings. So the octave, we've got the speaker wallowing in self-pity and depression. It says, when in disgrace with fortune. So he's disgraced, he has no money, and he's also been rejected by friends. He's in disgrace with his fortune and with men's eyes. So when he's by himself, it says he troubles deaf heaven. So he's crying out to heaven, but heaven is deaf. So we've got some more personification there. Bootless cries. That can be taken in a couple of different ways. One, as in he's so out of money, he does not even have shoes to put on his feet. And bootless, as in like they're weak cries. We think like boots on the ground. You think about like the military, boots on the ground, that type of thing. Bootless would mean that it's just not very effective. He's pretty pathetic here. He looks at himself, he curses his fate, and then he starts wishing that he was like other people, like someone else who had more hope or better features, who had friends, like him with friends possessed is kind of an interesting way that's expressed, but possessing friends. So desiring this man's art, like he wishes he has the talents of somebody else or the scope, the imagination of someone else. And he can't find joy in anything that he normally would be contented. So with what I most enjoy, the things I normally like doing, I am contented the least with those things. So this guy is depressed. And he's at a place where like he just can't find enjoyment in his everyday thing. All other things that he used to love, he just can't find joy in them. I think maybe a lot of us have been at that place at one time or another. But then there's the turn, and it's signaled here by the word yet. Yet in these thoughts, myself almost despising. So even as he's thinking these things, he happens to think on thee. And we have to think about, who is this thee, this person that he's thinking about? And it makes his hopes like to the lark. A lark is a bird, like a bird bursting forth at the beginning of day from the earth. And this bird is singing at heaven's gate, whereas before he had been crying out to deaf heaven. For thy sweet love remembered such wealth brings. So thy sweet love, when I think about your love, that gives me such wealth that I would scorn to change my state with kings. I wouldn't change places with a king because I have your love and when I think about your love. So there's a couple of ways that I kind of look at this poem. One, I think about, well, perhaps maybe he's thinking of his lady love, and just thinking about her gives him kind of the hope to endure and makes him realize, hey, I got it pretty good. But I also think too that this also could be a crying out, like a prayer to God as well. Thinking of the love of God helps to remind him of how blessed he is, and having that relationship is more important than being, the richest king on earth. So again, we have a contrast here. The second section of the poem, the sixth line, the sestet, replies in some way to the situation that's been put forth in the octave. Okay, so I guess you guys probably know what's coming next. We're going to practice writing some poems, but before we do that, um, I'm going to have you guys do a common lit assignment on Shakespeare's Sonnet 5, um, to help just kind of like review that sonnet form. And then we'll look at a couple more sonnets, and then we'll be thinking about writing our own sonnets.